Welcome to Midland's second edition of Nigeria's Energy Diagnosis. In this edition, we take a focused look at Nigeria's energy sector between the years 2000 and 2005, a period defined by transition, challenges, and foundational reforms. In the next few minutes, I'll walk you through key trends, generational patterns, system weaknesses, and the policy environments that shaped this era. Before the reforms, NEPA ran the entire power system as a government monopoly. There was no private investment, no competition, and service delivery remained limited. There were other challenges such as gas supply shortages, aging infrastructure, and the absence of an independent regulator also characterized this period. Because of these conditions, many Nigerians depended on generators rather than the national grid. To take us further in understanding this era, let's walk through how energy actually moved through the system. We start with the installed capacity, that is, the amount of power Nigeria was originally built to produce. From there, we move to the generation, where we see how much power was actually delivered from which sources. Then we follow the journey through to transmission and distribution, where some of that power gets lost along the way. And finally, we compare demand and supply to understand what Nigerians needed versus what the grid could realistically provide at the time. Looking at the installed capacity, by 2005, Nigeria operated 8 major power plants, 3 hydro and 5 thermal. Together, they provided a total installed capacity of about 6,434 megawatts. When we compare generation to installed capacity, we can see how much of the available capacity was actually producing power during this period. Generation began at 1,681 megawatts in 2000 and rose to 2,687 megawatts by 2005. Across the 6 years, the grid delivered an average of 2,278 megawatts, noticeably lower than the 6,434 megawatts installed capacity we saw earlier. This gives a clearer picture of the gap between what the system was built to produce and what it was actually generating. The generation mix during this period was heavily dominated by thermal sources, particularly natural gas, which accounted for approximately 70 to 75% of total electricity production. Hydroelectricity contributed 20 to 25%, while oil-based generation remained marginal at under 5%. This clearly demonstrates Nigeria's heavy dependence on natural gas for power generation. Looking at transmission and distribution losses in this era, we see that a significant portion of generated power did not reach the end users. Losses range between 5,500 and 8,000 gigawatt hours annually, which translates to roughly 30 to 35% of total generation. This means that out of every 10 units of electricity produced, only about 6 to 7 units were actually delivered to paying customers. Understanding this helps us see how much energy was lost before it got to the consumers. When we look at the per capita electricity consumption, we see a gradual rise from 74 kilowatt hour in 2000 to around 129 kilowatt hour in 2005. This increase suggests that even within the limitations of the era, more households and businesses were gradually connecting to the grid and using more electricity. It also hints at a growing need for more reliable supply because as the population and economic activity expands, per person consumption naturally rises and the system has to keep up. At the national level, total electricity consumption grew from about 9,100 gigawatt hour in 2000 to nearly 18,000 gigawatt hour in 2005. Across the period, the average consumption sits around 13,363 gigawatt hour. This reflects population growth, increasing productive activity, and agreed that needed more capacity and efficiency to meet rising demand. By 2005, estimates placed national electricity demand somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 megawatts. Meanwhile, peak generation was still struggling around 3,000 megawatts. The key point here is the size of the gap. It shows how the grid consistently operated far below what Nigerians actually needed, which explains the heavy reliance on generators and the pressure that later reforms tried to address. By 2005, the structure of the power sector had changed significantly. NEPA was dissolved and replaced with PHCN, and the sector was unbundled into separate companies, 6 for generation, 1 for transmission, and 11 for distribution. This period also introduced proper regulation through NERC and a clear legal framework. Independent power producers were officially allowed to operate, and projects like the Ofai Power Plant were commissioned. The government also launched the NIPP program, aiming to add over 4,000 megawatts of new capacity. Overall, 2005 closed the era with a more defined structure and a clearer roadmap for future reforms. Several factors shaped how the sector performed during this era. Many plants were old and often broke down, and gas shortages meant thermal plants could not operate fully. There were also transmission bottlenecks, which made it difficult to move power across the network. Tariffs didn't reflect cost of service, and revenue collection remained low. The hydro plant had seasonal drops in output, and the NEPA to PHCN transition came with institutional and operational limitations. All this together influenced how much power could ultimately reach the consumers during this era. To wrap up, this era marked a major turning point for Nigeria's power sector. Even though issues like gas shortages, low generation, and high losses continued, the period set the structure Nigeria still builds on today. In our next edition, we'll shift our focus to the mid-2000s and examine how the sector evolved after these early reforms. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned.